So we're going to finish up the Jews this morning and move on to the Greeks. So I want to just start off by looking at what you have for this section that I asked you to read relatively quickly on kingship in the Hebrews. So let's turn to page Hebrews kingship. Page 29. We have this interesting, in fact, just fascinating discussion here between God and Samuel. And so when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Now, just think about, not only is there some kind of decline in society here because of his sons, but think about the very structure of politics for the Jews. Everything is based on these judges, a kind of aristocracy that we have among Hebrews. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to govern us like all the nations." So they had been distinctive. Right? We talked about this. We talked about this with the covenant. We looked at the way the Jews thought of themselves in terms of creation. They were a distinctive people. And now suddenly they want to be like everybody else, and they want to have a king. And God is hesitant about this. And in fact, there's no stronger word we could use. He is really, really reluctant to allow this to happen, as we'll see here. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Hearken to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." Right? God takes this pretty personally. Why have they rejected it? Your judges were meant to be in my stead. Obviously, that didn't work because your sons became perverted in terms of justice and took bribes. But still, there's hope. There's something we can do to fix this. Now then, hearken to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king, how shall reign over them. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking a king from him. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to chariots and be horsemen, and run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make implements of war, and to equip the chariots. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards, and olive orchards, excuse me, and give them to his servants. He will take the 10th of your flock, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord shall not answer you in that day." Right? So we get this incredible prophecy. If you become like everybody else, this is what's going to happen. And we get these 5 things that will happen to the people of Israel if they take a king. And all of them basically suggest that God is a jealous God. He doesn't want a king before him, but he will acquiesce, because we see, but the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but we will have a king over us, and we will be like all the other nations." So Israel is making a major change here in the way that she governs herself. And the king is now going to be a human king as opposed to a divine king. So what happens here? Let me just throw this open for a moment. What's going to be the result of this for Israel? And some of this was just blatantly stated. What? Yeah, Will.
I mean, their kings are going to look similar to kind of like the whole of their people look like. They'll start off good and then they'll fall. And
Okay.
They'll start off good and then they'll fall.
So what's the promise that they'll be any better than the judges were?
There isn't.
Yeah, there isn't one, right? And it doesn't even seem to be the case that the people are that concerned about a corrupt king. They just want a king, right? Okay, what else? What's this going to do to the very people themselves? Yeah, Jack.
Become slaves.
Okay, right? I mean, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but that's the language that's used, right? Your people will be as slaves. And of course, they've already been enslaved. And one of the reasons that they were given the 10 Commandments was to be taught how to live like a free people out of slavery. So this seems very confusing that they've been brought out of slavery, and yet they seem willing to sell themselves into slavery yet again. Right? Again, a little bit of an exaggeration in terms of language. It's not quite slavery, but it's close. Right? It's very close. Why? What is it that they'll have to give up? Yeah, Lucy.
Their land and their ownership of their own work and the rewards of their work.
Absolutely, right? The rewards of the sweat of their brow. So the kinds of things that they've been commanded to do, to work the earth, now they're going to have to give part of that up, right? And part of it up to centralized political authority. So we have this very interesting moment here, and it's an interesting moment in world history, but certainly very important for Hebraic history, where we have this change. So for those of you who had a chance to read this, and remember I told you could read it pretty quickly, to go through this on kingship from the Hebrews, what do we learn? What happens with their kings? Things work well? Okay. What happens? Yeah, Maggie.
Like a repetitive pattern of reversal. So they'll start out, humble and obedient and faithful, and then they'll go corrupt in their ways and end up prideful and sort of have their own agenda separate.
Do you remember the two we get to read about?
Saul and David.
Yeah, we read about Saul and David. And what are we told? Does he withhold his grace from them at first? Doesn't he put his spirit upon each of them? So he acquiesces in some ways, and they have the spirit of the Lord upon them. But both Saul and David fall in one way or another. Right? Saul, well, basically both through pride in all kinds of ways. But let's think about David for a moment. And this is where I told you guys I wanted you to know the story, but we don't have to go into great detail about it. What does David do? You have to be a little bit PG-13, 16R here. What's David do? Yeah,
He has an affair and kills someone.
Yeah.
Cover up.
So think about this, right? He sees this woman. He sees her from across the building tops. He doesn't even know her. He's taken with her. He's taken with her figure, right? And he's so smitten with her that he has to get to know her. And of course, it turns out that she is the wife of Uriah, one of his officers. And so he takes Uriah and puts Uriah in the very front lines of battle to get rid of him so that he can have Bathsheba to himself. This is incredible. And this is someone who has the Spirit of the Lord upon him who does this. Now, I bring this up not necessarily to pass judgment. I mean, clearly what David did was wrong. What does David do, though, afterwards that neither Adam nor Eve did? Yeah, Rachel.
He repents.
He repents.
For God's forgiveness.
Yeah, he does repent. And of course, we get Solomon out of all of this as the child. Right? Pretty amazing that all of this works out the way that it does. But from reading the story, does David ever truly get his family back together? No, right? It's just one problem after another in his family. So I bring this up for a number of reasons, but the main reason is this. Obviously, it's in your textbook. We've got to read it. It's in your reader. But one of the most important aspects of David is that he will be the major stumbling block for pagans to convert to Christianity when we get to Rome. So when the Romans are converting the Christians, they're trying to, and frankly, they're doing a really good job at it. But the one stumbling block is the pagans will always bring up, and we'll see this because we're going to be talking quite a bit about him. They'll say, you have David, and David is just an eyesore to our souls. In every way, this is a guy that we cannot imitate, and yet he's one of your great heroes for this religion. We have Socrates. Socrates was blameless, and he died for his community and gave his life for his community. And so this becomes a great struggle in the ancient world for Christians, that they have to carry the weight of David with them because he is such a stumbling block for people to convert. Whereas the pagans, especially the Stoics, but mostly the Stoics can say, no, but we've got Socrates, and Socrates was blameless in the sight of God. That's going to be a huge factor when talking about conversions later on. So I want you to remember that. There's another reason we talk about David. What's the relationship between Samuel and Saul and Nathan and David. Regardless of what your own religious viewpoint is, what might you think that's a relationship of? What does that kind of indicate that you see here? Gwen?
Well, I think they they're mostly messengers from God to, Samuel is a messenger kind of from God to Saul, and Nathan from God to David, but also in a way sort of mentors.
Okay.
And I was kind of thinking as I read this, I wonder if, I know that reading this is kind of how it shaped monarchies throughout the West. Like wondering if that's kind of where we wound up with the idea of like the Archbishop of Canterbury crowning the kings and whatnot.
That's exactly right. You've got it exactly, Gwen. That's what happens. So this whole relationship between Samuel and Saul and Nathan and David becomes the relationship between the religious figure and the king. Now, think about that for a moment, and even more than the Archbishop of Canterbury, really the Pope and the king, right? So, whether you're Catholic or not, this just becomes the norm for an understanding of how that relationship works out. So, what does that say about that relationship of, say, a papal authority versus the king? What can we say about that relationship? What can Nathan do to David? Yeah.
Criticize him.
And is that about it?
I mean, he can harshly criticize him.
Okay, yeah. He can
and tell him what to
harshly
do.
criticize him,
And
right?
give him directions.
That's about the extent of his power, right? And this is going to be both a blessing and a problem for all of Western civilization, because the religious leader only has the ability to criticize the political leader. So it's going to get tougher than that. Obviously, there are other things you can do, and especially when you get into Christianity with sacramentality, you can withdraw the sacraments from the king. And this is what we call, anybody know what's the term when a political leader can no longer participate in the sacraments? Excommunication, right? This is, you can excommunicate. And yet, it doesn't necessarily mean a lot. There's nothing, for example, in the Catholic Church, simply because you can't take communion doesn't mean you're going to hell. So there's no power, for example, to anathematize somebody within the Catholic Church or within Christianity at all. All you can do is withhold the sacraments, which means you can probably delay, from a Catholic perspective, you can delay someone's entrance into heaven, but you're just giving them more time in purgatory more than anything else. So this really is, I won't say it's hollow, it's not hollow, but it's a power that has to be used very wisely and can only be used if the papal or the archbishop type figure carries with them incredible weight. So we're going to talk later in the semester. We won't get to this in this semester, but later, well, okay, I've got two examples. One we'll get to, the other one we won't. We'll get to the Archbishop of Canterbury and one of the great conflicts he has where he is, as T.S. Eliot wrote, murdered in the cathedral when he goes against his king. The king just has him cut down, but the person becomes more powerful in death, frankly, because of the image that he carries, because he's a martyr for all intents and purposes. But not in your lifetime, but in my lifetime, John Paul II, as Pope, was able to use his moral authority to bring down all kinds of things. Really to destroy communism from within. So it is a power that is rare, but it can work. But it's going to depend a lot on the circumstances, and it's going to depend a lot on the moral authority. For example, and I'm not trying to be rude to our current Pope, but if our current Pope tried to do something that John Paul II did, I think there would be just a lot of laughter. He just doesn't carry that kind of moral weight that John Paul II did as Pope. Even non-Catholics respected John Paul II and kind of feared him because of his moral authority. That doesn't seem to be the case with our current Pope, who, well, yeah, I'm going to start getting into editorials here, and I don't want to do that. But he just doesn't seem to carry that kind of moral authority in any way, shape, or form. So, but this is great. So Gwen, perfect. That this is really the form we get of the religious figure to the political leader. And what it means is that throughout Western civilization, we will have a separation of church and state. It is very rare in the West to have a confluence of church and state. They're almost always in opposition to each other, but generally the only thing that the church can do to the state is condemn it. It can't do much more than that, which means it has power and it doesn't have power at the same time. Does this make sense for everyone? Okay, and you see, so even, for example, when Queen Elizabeth, may God bless her, but when she passes away, and she's obviously getting up there in age, whoever, will it be William, when he becomes king, they'll go through the same kind of ceremony. And any of you who've read The Lord of the Rings, you know that when Aragorn is crowned, they go through the exact same ceremony, where Frodo as priest carries the crown to Gandalf the prophet. The prophet then puts the crown on top of the head of the king. Right? It's all very, very medieval, but also very Davidic in the way that we see here, very Hebraic. So, in a sense, Samuel as well as Nathan are, I forget how you put it, you call them counselors, I think?
My mentors.
Yeah, they're prophets, right? For more, all intents and purposes, the best term would be to use prophet. So prophet and king is the relationship that we get here. Good. Okay, well, thanks, guys, for that. So unless there are any questions, and obviously since you have your paper dealing with the Hebrews, don't hesitate if anyone wants to ask me any kind of, you can keep asking me next week or whenever, but if you have any questions about the Hebrews, please bring them up. So yeah, Lucy.
In our paper, is the part about the Hebrews on kingship, is that something you want us to include or can we include?
I think a really good paper, like an A paper, would at least reference it in some way. But a lot is going to depend on what you focus on. So because it's such an open-ended question, there's a good chance that you're going to really focus on creation, or you'll focus on law, or you'll focus on kingship. But I do think a solid paper would at least make reference to all three of those things, since those three things were here. But a lot's going to depend on how you do that. It may even be like in a footnote. So I don't think it has to be a main point of the paper. But let me put it this way. When I ask you about the Jews on your midterm, which amazingly enough, we're only like 3.5 weeks away from your first midterm. The time goes very quickly, as you'll see. The hours are long and the days are short, right? They're very short. But I'll expect you, I don't think you'll be able to answer a question about the Jews without bringing at least all three of those things in to a certain extent. Your paper less so because it's your own artistic creation.
Right.
Yeah. Does that help? So it's kind of a non-answer, but...
No, it was totally...
Okay, all right, good. All right, anybody else on anything we've had with the Jews? Okay, one thing to keep in mind about the ancient Hebrews is they are, and we saw this pretty clearly, though we didn't talk about it, when we saw Abram and Sarai, they are a Near Eastern people. The Jews come out of the Near East. We're going to turn to the Greeks now, and we're going to be in the Greeks for quite a while, maybe longer than we should, but we're going to get delayed here for a little bit and kind of park and think about what the Greeks are really about. The Greeks are going to be, in this class, the first truly Western people. And so we break down history between the Greeks and the Easterners this way. We talk about it, these terms have become, they're not politically incorrect yet, but they could be by tomorrow, depending on how things go. But kind of the old-fashioned way of thinking about this is you have the Occident, which is another name for West, and you have the Orient, which is another name for East. And it is getting, not quite, but it's getting to the point where Oriental is becoming an unacceptable term. But all this means traditionally is that there is a divide in the way that people think east to west. And so the Greeks are really on that border, and I should have brought a map in today, but when you think about where Greece is situated, especially next to Turkey, Turkey really represents Eastern civilization, Oriental civilization, and the Greeks represent Western civilization. And the Jews came out of the eastern part, migrating into the western part. So the Greeks, as far as we know, migrate into their area from the west to the west and remain in the west. in the Occident. And so obviously for this class, a class called Western Heritage, we're going to try and think a lot about what it means to be Western. And so we could have probably started the class not illegitimately today. Today could have been the first, and then we could have gone back, for example, when we got to the Christians. Then we could have gone back and looked at the Jews and done kind of a retrospective into Christianity. But we're following a slightly different model where we're looking at what Russell Kirk said were the 4 iconographic cities. So we went Jerusalem, and then Athens, and then we'll go to Rome, and then we'll come back to Jerusalem again before we get to London. And chronologically, that makes sense as well. But here's what I want to just state bluntly about what the West is and what distinguishes the West from the East, or at least gives the West its specific characteristics. There are 2 things that define the West. One, and we'll talk more about this, so write this down for now, but we'll keep talking about it. One is sacrifice, the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than yourself. We see this always, and you guys are at a place where we as a college have sacrificed, especially during the American Civil War. We sacrificed much. We gave many of our students to defend the Northern cause against the Southern institution of slavery. This college, more than any other Northern college, can claim that, more than any of them. That is our legacy. That is our heritage here. And in part, one of the reasons that Hillsdale men were so willing to give of themselves during the Civil War was because they were inspired by the Greeks. And the Greeks were the first to do it. And I'm going to read here from Herodotus in just a little bit to kind of get that. But the second thing that we find is not just sacrifice, but we also find in the West there is a real desire to understand the nature of freedom and liberty. So it's not just that we sacrifice, but we have to choose to sacrifice ourselves. And that may seem like a contradiction, especially if you're coming from a straight libertarian background. The idea that you would use your freedom to sacrifice is kind of a head scratcher. But that's how it's always worked in the West, that you have this desire to sacrifice, but you have to have the freedom to do so. So if I forced Sam to sacrifice, it is still a sacrifice, but it doesn't have the same meaning as if Sam gave of himself completely to a cause and then was rewarded in that cause by essentially martyrdom in some way. And even to talk about the rewards of martyrdom, I realize we're starting to get into sticky ground. But that's the tradition of the West, and we're going to see it over and over again. So we're going to look at these people like Socrates. Socrates, one of the greatest figures in all of history. Obviously nothing compared to Jesus, but if we leave Jesus out of it, Socrates is right there at the top. He dies. He's murdered by his own people. We're going to get to Cicero. Cicero was the greatest of the Romans, without question the greatest of the Romans. He's murdered by his own people. We'll get to Jesus, obviously, again, beyond compare, murdered by his own people. Later on, and towards the end of the class, we'll get to Sir Thomas More, murdered by his own people. I mean, this is crazy, but this is the pattern that we see with so many people in the West who matter. They often challenge what is better, or not better, what is superior to themselves in terms of power, and they have to pay the ultimate price for that. And of course, we do it all the time with our soldiers. We do have to think about, it's one of the reasons that our withdrawal from Afghanistan has been so painful. It's not simply because it was right or wrong. It's probably in the long run right to get out of Afghanistan. I mean, we haven't been able to do much there for quite a while. We won the war and we stayed there and then weren't able to accomplish much. So there's nothing inherently wrong with withdrawing from a conflict that we couldn't win. But the way we've done it and the sacrifice that's gone with it, the unnecessary sacrifice that's gone with all of it, especially the 13 Marines who were killed, it's gut-wrenching. And you think about the number 13 is not that big of a number. It's not like we lost 100,000 soldiers last week, right? We lost 13. But there's something about 13, and it could have been 12 or it could have been 14, but there's something about a small enough number that we can imagine sitting in this room right now. I've been very moved on social media, all the people who've set out the beers, the 13 beers for the missing men. It hits us because we recognize this was a sacrifice, and it was a worthy sacrifice, but it was a sacrifice that didn't need to happen. That's what's crazy about it, and we're conflicted about this. A worthy sacrifice, but one that didn't necessarily need to happen. So the Greeks teach us from the very beginning that there is nothing worth possessing that you don't sacrifice for. So this is why I suggest that when we look to the West and we look to the Greeks to try and understand what the Greeks are doing, we have sacrifice and we have liberty. So a huge part of the rivalry between the Orient and the Occident comes about because there is a massive empire where Turkey is now, all the way to Iraq and Iran, called Persia. Persia represents everything that is non-Western. There you have the Persian king, who is truly a god king. He is divine from their perspective. We have Xerxes, and then we have Darius, two of the great god kings. Their people are not free citizens. They are absolutely subject to the god king. And so Persia is a massive empire. It's innovative in all kinds of ways. It's technologically advanced. It has millions of people in its own orbit. It controls a vast amount of resources and a vast amount of land. And then on the other side, on the west, you have 150 Greek city-states. Not even unified. Places like Corinth and Thessaly, and places like Sparta, places like Athens, that aren't unified except by their own language and some of their culture and some of their religion. But they have no similar political systems. So Corinth's political system, even though it's a Greek city-state and very close to, say, Sparta, is completely different from Sparta's city-state in politics. So you have 150 little communities, each with their own customs and norms, being challenged by the Persian god king. And the Persian god king, both Xerxes and Darius, look to the West, and they look to Greece, and they could not, if they didn't have to, they wouldn't have to bother with Greece at all. They could just ignore Greece. But Greece offends the pride and sensibility of the god king. Absolutely offends him. How can these people believe that they can live without something superior to themselves? How can they believe that they can live according to their own desires and according to their own will? Now, we look at those city-states, and some seem to be free. Athens was a relatively free city-state. Right? We understand that they pretty much govern themselves, given at what time period we're talking about. Sparta was never what any of us in this room would define as free. Sparta was a military dictatorship with a dual monarchy, and everything was ruled by the dual monarch. But from the Spartan perspective, they had, and this is where freedom in the ancient world is different from freedom for the modern world. Freedom in the modern world means basically I can do whatever I want as long as I don't harm another person. Right? So as long as I'm not harming you directly, physically, I can do almost anything. Freedom in the ancient world meant you have the ability to govern yourself however you wish to govern yourself. So the Spartans actually believed that they were a free people, even though they were governed by this dual monarchy and had this military dictatorship. They believed that they were free because they believed that they had consented to that form of government. This is a really different concept of freedom, so I want to make sure everyone's with me on this. Okay, so that's their idea of freedom, the ability to determine their own self-governance. It's a fiction in a lot of ways, but it's an important fiction. So the Persian kings look west. They're deeply offended by the Greeks. The Greeks are also spreading some of their ideas and their culture into Persia, and so the Persians decide to go full-blown war against the Greeks around 500. So about 500 BC, the Persians launch several invasions of Greece, and they do this over a period of years. And so I'm going to read to you from an invasion in 479, but it's really the final invasion that the Persians launch against the Greeks. The Greeks, remember, are not unified. When they fight as Athens, they fight as Sparta, they fight as Corinth. They don't fight as Greece until one moment where the Spartans make this great sacrifice. So in this invasion of 480 and 479, the Persian king decides he's not only going to send his navy against the Greeks across the Mediterranean, and I'm so sorry I didn't bring a map in today. That was really foolish of me. But I'll try and bring one in for Friday so you can get a good look. But we're going to cross the Mediterranean with the navy, but he orders 100,000 of his best troops to march along the coast of the Mediterranean so that, if you can imagine, if this is Turkey and this is Greece, and this is the land to the north of it, the Persians will march all across the Mediterranean and down into the Greek Isles. And it's supposed to be a full-scale invasion with the navy and the army all hitting at the same time. But there's this little pass, this tiny little narrow mountain pass north of Athens called the Gates of Fire or Thermopylae. And you guys have to know this for this class. I mean, this is just one of those great moments in the Western tradition. And King Leonidas, one of the two kings of Sparta, gets there with 300 men. And I'm sure you've heard the 300, right? There's the movie 300 based on this. And so these 300 men under Leonidas all say, we're here to die. It's going to be us against 100,000 Persians. There's no way we're going to win, but we're going to die in glory and give ourselves to great sacrifice. And Leonidas had visited with the oracle being kind of a priest. And the priest had told him, Leonidas, you're going to die. That's clear. But you're either going to die in great disgrace or great glory, and it's up to you. And so Leonidas wants so badly to go out in a blaze of glory. And so he and his 300 men commit themselves to this spot, this little spot in the mountain pass to stop the Spartans. And amazingly enough, they hold off for days. They're able, wave after wave after wave of this 100,000 keeps coming at the Spartans, and the Spartans are able to hold them off time and time again. Ultimately, they fail, but because they're betrayed by one of their own who shows a way to sneak behind the mountain pass so that the Spartans are crushed from within. But I want to read to you, this is from, and you have for Friday, I'd asked you to read Herodotus, that selection that we have for Herodotus. You haven't read it yet, but I want to read to you from Herodotus. So Herodotus, by the way, this is a big book. We only give you one little section of it. This is one of the best books I've ever read in my life. You can't, once you start it, you cannot put this book down. It is the early history of Greece, but Herodotus is not dry at all. His stories are hilarious. They're profound. They're deep. They're everything you can imagine a good historian would be. And he's the first historian, and he is really, really good. But he's also a Greek patriot. And what he wants to show is that the Greeks are the real men, and the Persians, because they don't believe in freedom, are not true men. That's his main argument. They may be human, but they're not men. They don't share in what allows us to be the best of who we are. And so this is, I'm not going to read the whole, there's a whole chapter on Thermopylae, but one paragraph. Xerxes, who's the god king, let 4 whole days elapse while expecting that the Greeks, the Spartans, would run away. But when on the 5th day they still had not gone away, but were instead holding their position in what seemed to him to be a display of reckless impudence, he lost his temper and he ordered his absolute best troops out against the Spartans with instructions to bring as many back alive as possible as to conduct interrogations. His men charged headlong into the Spartans, but they fell in great numbers. And although others rushed to replace them, even they could not drive the Spartans away, though they too suffered great losses in the attempt. Indeed, the Greeks made it clear to everyone, but especially to Xerxes, the god king himself, that although there were many in his army, he had no men. and the fighting went on all day. I mean, this is incredible, right? He has 100,000 soldiers, but not one man. And that statement on the part of Herodotus, granted a very biased, patriotic statement, but nonetheless, I would argue that what I just read to you was the birth of Western civilization. It was that moment when the last Spartan gave his life for this. A Spartan who didn't have to give his life for Athens or Corinth or Thessaly, but did because he believed in it. He believed in something greater than himself. That's really the moment of Western civilization. And I think we could have, had we wanted to, started with that battle on Wednesday last week when we started class. This is really the beginning of Western civilization. And I think an incredible moment. So keep that in mind as we're talking about the nature of of what's going on in Greece. So let me just talk a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about Herodotus, and then I want to talk a little bit about Greece as well. Herodotus, at the beginning of his book, tries to describe what every life is like. And this is not the selection that you have in your reader. So the selection you have is probably a made-up scenario, but it's a scenario where a number of Persians have kind of taken off and they no longer want to support Xerxes, and so they're debating amongst themselves what their best government could be. And so I do read that very carefully. It's a really important reading, but we'll talk about that on Friday. So at the beginning of Herodotus' book, and remember, this is the first historian, at the beginning he says, all the days in a life add up to about 26,250. So this is the norm for the human person. That is, if we live 70 years, we live about 26,250 days. That's, when you think about that, when you think about every day that you've experienced, that's not that long. And of course, Herodotus wants us to recognize that. That's really not that long of a life. It's a relatively short life. So 26,250 days. But what is amazing is that every day brings with it something completely different from every other day. So no matter how much sameness we may experience, there will always be something new if we have eyes to see. If we can see how precious that day is, and that particular day, not just, oh, it was a Wednesday, I got through it, but a day that actually contributed something new to your life. A great thought experiment for any of us at the end of our day. Say your evening prayers, and then just imagine, what was today the one thing I'd never heard or known or seen before? What is it? Right? Just a great thing to kind of catalog right before we go to sleep. But he tells us, he says, then we must ask, what makes for happiness? Especially at the end of your life, what makes the human person happy? I cannot tell you exactly because my life is not ended, and therefore I can't tell you exactly if I lived up to the end of my life. But I can say this. You will see that a man who is very wealthy is often no more happy, more prosperous in the soul than the man who had only enough to live day to day, unless good fortune stayed with him and he retained his fair and noble possessions right up until he departs from this life, if he is morally happy. For many wealthy people are deeply unhappy, while many others who have more modest resources are deeply happy. The man who has great wealth but is unhappy outdoes the fortunate man in only two ways, while the fortunate man outdoes him in almost every way. The former is more capable of gratifying his passions and of sustaining himself in adversity, but the fortunate man, that is the morally satisfied man, although he does not have the same ability to sustain himself in adversity or passion, avoids sickness and avoids all that could be seen as hindering a good fortune. He may have no injury, no sickness, no painful experience, and he may even retain into adulthood the goodness of his children and maybe even his good looks. But now, and if in addition to all of these things, he ends his life well too, then this is the man that you are looking for. He alone deserves to be called happy and prosperous. But before he dies, refrain from calling him this. Rather say he has been lucky. So the only thing that really matters, and I think this is very, very Greek, the only thing that really matters is that you're morally satisfied at the end of your life, that you made the right choices. Bless you, Phoebe. That you made the right choices. Not that you've earned the most stuff. And there's nothing wrong as long as you've done it morally. There's absolutely nothing wrong with earning lots of money. That's perfectly legitimate as long as it's been done morally. But what matters is the moral choice. That's what matters. And so when you die, did you have the children that you wanted? Did you raise the children in the best fashion? Have your children recognized you for what you've done? And you can't force any of that. You can only do your best, and you can only make your moral decisions moment by moment. Think how unbelievably different the world would have been if Leonidas had decided to run away. Think about how different the world would be if he could not have convinced his 300 men to stay with him at Thermopylae. How different. Would they have really have been men in the way that we recognize, or the way that Herodotus recognizes? Herodotus had been a soldier. He had fought. He had done his duty. But now he's an old man, and he's trying to figure out, what does this life mean? What is the good life? And for him, the good life is the morally blameless life. And we're going to see this with Socrates as well. So we're going to come back to Herodotus, but I want to say something here about the Greek way of life, especially in an understanding that they have of how to live that moral life. The Greeks come up with a way of living that they call philosophy. And philosophy means to love wisdom. This is what philosophy is. It literally means philo, to love, Sophie, wisdom. Where we get the word Sophia, so sophomore comes from this, other words. So philosophy is a way of life. And the Greeks in the beginning come up with philosophy roughly about the year 510. So 510 BC, we see the first philosophers. And again, I should have brought a map in, but almost all the first philosophy occurs in a little town called Miletus. Miletus, Miletus. And Miletus, it's now underwater, unfortunately, but Miletus, which is in the Aegean, is this little town right on the edge of what is Greece and what is Persia. And it traded hands numerous times during its history between the Persians and the Greeks, who controlled it, who didn't. But it was there in this little town that the first philosophers started to arise. And what the philosophers asked was a brilliant set of questions. They wanted to know why we all look alike as human, but we're all different. This was their great question. Why is it? So I'm 53, as I've told you guys, and you're 18. And yet we have so much in common, especially if a dog walked into the room right now, which would be kind of shocking in and of itself. But we would instantly recognize it's a dog. We would absolutely know it's not a human. We would recognize that the dog has certain characteristics not. But if a person walked in the door, we would also know immediately there are certain things that go along with this person. And despite their age, we would recognize them as a fellow human, and we might categorize them. Oh, it's a 3-year-old, or it's a 60-year-old, or it's someone in their middle age, wherever they may be, or maybe it's just another student who walked in. But we recognize all that. And the Greeks are fascinated by this. How is it possible that Jack and I can have almost everything in common? But I was born in 1967, and he was born around the year 2000. What? How does that happen? Why is it? And why is it that Jack is the beginning of his life, and I'm at the end, or middle, towards the middle of the end of my life? Why? What? How does that work? And then there was a baby born yesterday, and there's probably being a baby born right now somewhere in the world. Yeah, they're at the very beginning of their life. And at some point, they will actually look like Jack or me, or if they're blessed, they'll look like Gwen or one of you non-males in the room. There's something that we all have absolutely in common. And that's amazing. And so the question that the Greeks ask is actually a tragic one. Why is it that every person has to go through these cycles? And why are those cycles never endless? In other words, the Greeks become concerned that we are trapped in the cycles of humanity, that we just keep doing this: birth, middle age, death, birth, middle age, death, birth, middle age, death. That we just keep doing this over and over again and we get nowhere. That the human species just keeps repeating itself. And then they look outside and they look at something like a tree and they see the tree behaves in a certain way in summer very differently than in fall, and very differently in winter, and very differently in spring. But then it starts all over again. There's not a fifth thing. There is summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring. But there's no fifth thing. It all starts over again. And the Greeks are utterly perplexed by this. This is the beginning of philosophy. All philosophy begins with this observation: sameness and continuity, and yet what does it mean? Why are we repeating ourselves? How do we get out of it? And I want you, for those of you who come from a Christian background, the obvious answer to this is what gets us out of this is Christ. Christ is grace. Christ is movement. Christ is spirit. Christ is everything incarnationally for trying to understand who and what we are. But we've got 500 years to wait. The Greeks are asking this question 500 years before Jesus is being born. And I also want you to know another thing that I find fascinating, and I have no explanation for this. But at the same moment the Greeks are asking this question, Buddha is teaching at the exact same moment. And he's teaching almost identical things. Confucius is alive at this exact same moment and asking the same things in Chinese culture. And the very Vedic writings of Hinduism, those founders of Hinduism, are alive at this very moment and asking the same questions. How do you possibly account for that? I honestly have no idea. I just find it amazing that Indian culture, European culture, and Chinese culture are literally at the same moment, about 510 BC. They don't know each other, but they're all asking these same questions. That's incredible. I mean, to me, that's an argument for providence. But I mean, that's just my guess. But that's incredible. Okay, that's probably a good place to stop. Anybody have any final questions or comments? All right, thanks for putting up with my enthusiasm here. I love this stuff. So we will pick this back up. If somebody would remind me, when we meet on Friday, we will start immediately with what the Greek philosophy is, okay, and how they break that down. So I just asked the questions, but we didn't get into it. And do read those next two readings. Read Pericles' funeral oration and read the history, okay? And then for Monday, I want you to read the Crito. And I haven't really talked about the Crito. The Crito is probably the most difficult reading you'll do this semester. So just know that you're going to need to go through it a couple of times. But start reading that from Monday. Okay? Thanks, everybody.